I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to a very special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I have gathered a panel here to talk about two of my favorite movies. Now, this is kind of strange to be covering movies from 1961 and 1978 with a podcast, but I have a very unique reason for them. The Guns of Navarone and Force 10 from Navarone, based on the Alister Maclean novels, are two of the biggest influences for my novel, The Last Night to Kill Nazis, which comes out this summer, August 2023. And so to celebrate the pre-order period, you can go and pre-order it now from my publisher, Clash Books, or Barnes & Nobles, Books A Million. They all have it. If you're here in San Diego, I recommend going to Mysterious Galaxies in Point Loma to get it there, because I will sign copies. So anybody can pre-order it through them. And so if you want a signed copy, that's a place where you can get them. But the idea for this series is to talk about World War II movies and how they influenced this book. And so every once in a while, you'll hear references to things. I'll talk about things that, because there's lots of Easter eggs, especially for the Navarone books and movies in The Last Night to Kill Nazis. But there's also references to other classics like Where Eagles Dare and The Dirty Dozen and so on, which we will be covering in this series. Now, in addition to that, we will eventually cover a few movies I've never seen before, because there's World War II movies that I want to expand and see how they kind of fit into that mold. Like Five Graves to Cairo or Attack. I've never seen Attack. I've heard it's amazing. So, but now, one of the returning to the show is Marc Rothenberg, who you guys know if you listen to this podcast, from our Top Reads of the Year series and the Best Horror Stories series with Laird Barron and Mary Sangiovanni. And we actually, I believe we made reference to the Navarone books, or maybe it was just when I was talking to Laird about his Isaiah Coleridge novels. Devlin McCarthy is an old friend of mine from Syracuse, where I used to live. And Devlin is a uber nerd for all things World War II and World War II movies. And so I recruited him here for that reason. He was also the first person I sent an early draft of The Last Night to Kill Nazis to, for just opinions on accuracy and getting the era correct. So he's read the book. Mark has not yet. So there may be times where Devlin has a little inside knowledge because he has read the book. So welcome, Mark and Devlin. Let's start with Devlin. What's your history with, or how'd you get into World War II stuff, and what's your history with these two movies?
Probably like anyone my age is going to answer, through my dad. When I woke up, when I was growing up as a kid, like that's, books about World War II, movies about World War II, like model kits about World War II, everything. So from an early age, I was kind of inundated with that, and it stuck with me. I've always been into reading and doing stuff. When I lived in Florida, I was a reenactor for a few years. So firsthand experience sort of with some of the gear and day-to-day stuff. So
well, and when did you see these movies? Did you see them when you were young?
Oh yeah, I saw them. I mean, all I did when I was a kid was watch TV. So these movies were in, well, at least, Guns of Navarone was in heavy rotation on TV when we were growing up. Force 10 I saw a little bit later, but And actually, it's the first time I watched either of those movies in years to prepare for today. So, Force 10, I've
Yeah.
only seen a couple times, so that was sort of fresh eyes on that one.
Oh, interesting. I've watched them a couple times. I watched them when I was gearing up to write this book. So I went back and rewatched them in that regard too. So, and I have you read you said you haven't read the Alister Maclean novels, right?
No,
So, okay.
my dad had read them. So I'm familiar with some of the differences between the movie and the novel, but not with firsthand experience.
Mark, what's your interest level in World War II, and where did you or how long ago did you first see these movies?
Well, I think World War II comes to me partially because I'm Jewish, right? I mean, my father was of that generation who lived through it, so it was very inundated early on that, you had to be aware of not only World War II, but the effect it had on my religion, my culture. As far as the movies go, I remember when I was a kid at a friend's house, one of the first war movies I remember seeing was The Big Red One. And then over time, war movies weren't really what I was into, but I did get into adventure movies. And I remember specifically probably, I don't know, I was like probably 9 years old. I remember seeing Force 10 from Navarone, largely probably because of Harrison Ford, because that was right after Star Wars. And I was like, hey, I want to go see that movie. It's got the guy from Star Wars in it. And I really enjoyed that movie. I really, really, really enjoyed Force 10. Later on, I did see Guns of Navarone, so I saw Guns of Navarone secondly, right, out of order. However, and when we talk about my rewatch of it, because I probably haven't seen Force 10 from Navarone in 35 years, I think my opinion on it has changed a little bit, but for different reasons. But
Yeah, we
as a
might end
movie,
up
more of as
arguing
a
that
film
one.
critic, right? Yeah. But no, but that's how I remember these movies. I remember specifically seeing A Bridge Too Far actually in college with you and John Shipper sitting on the couch. John's like, we need to watch A Bridge Too Far. So
Right.
that's where we watched that. I remember. So, I mean, war movies, it's not my preferred genre, but I can appreciate a good war movie.
And he's a reenactor too.
And he's a reenactor too.
Yeah, John he did more like Civil War stuff, but
Civil War.
he did do World War II as well. Yeah. And he's an old friend of ours who probably will end up listening to this episode. So shout out to John. So here's my history on this is that my father loved World War II mission movies too, and Guns of Navarone I remember watching on ABC like Sunday Night Movie or something like that. But I'm not sure if I think I saw Force 10 first, but I remember watching Guns of Navarone on an ABC TV movie. And there was one time I believe I have a very distinct memory of complaining that Guns of Navarone was a little boring and getting a lecture from my father well, about how tense the scene of them climbing up the side of the mountain was, and how if you are bored right now, it's because you're not putting yourself in the shoes of the characters. And it was the first time as a very young person that my father like really talked to me about putting yourself in the shoes of the characters. And so I have a very distinct memory of watching Guns of Navarone for that conversation with my father. So, but I definitely, when I was a kid, I think I preferred, well, I might be getting ahead of ourselves, but let's talk about the movies in the order that they came out and talk about. I can give a little bit of background on Guns of Navarone was the 1961. It was the 1961 movie, and it was an American production, which is important because that's why they ended up with Gregory Peck playing a British guy and not giving a shit about trying to do an accent. And one of the things about the Alister Maclean novels had already started becoming bestsellers, and if you factor in, like there was less time between World War II and the Guns of Navarone than there was between like Nirvana and now, which is like really hard to think about like time
I was
wise.
kind of thinking about that last night as I was watching it too. I'm like, Me and you've been friends twice as long as time elapsed between the end of the war and the filming of that film, which is kind
Exactly.
of crazy.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about the fact that a lot of these World War II movies had a closer historical accuracy, or um, um, uh, resonance than like a lot of the Vietnam movies we watched in the 80s, right? When we were growing up, which especially if you think of movies like Platoon or like the ones that were trying to be more realistic. I was about to say Full Metal Jacket, but I'm not going to put that in the realistic category.
I think part of
Necessarily.
that was though because I mean it's interesting you point that out because the first thing I was going to say is because I think everyone involved in those World War II movies, it was still very fresh in their minds. But with those 1980 movies, Vietnam was still very fresh in everyone's minds, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think there was a different attitude, clearly, as we all know, about Vietnam
Definitely
versus World War
the
II,
sort of
right?
cultural perception of
Yeah.
Vietnam versus World War II, like absolutely.
It was a much more heroic view of World War II. And I mean, there was definitely
More reason for
not that the
that. Yeah.
Vietnamese weren't vilified, but there was the vilification of both Germans and Japanese. I mean, it spanned everywhere to cartoons, right? Bugs Bunny fought the Germans. Donald
Yeah.
Duck fought the Germans, right? I mean, it was everywhere.
Well, right. And then one of the things that was going on a lot in Hollywood was veterans being cast in these movies, even though they weren't the appropriate ages. So, like Lee Marvin is a prime example. And another great Lee Marvin, not just The Dirty Dozen, but probably one of the best examples of a Lee Marvin performance where his experience bleeds into the movie would be Hell in the Pacific, right? Which basically was remade as Enemy Mine in science fiction, um, but Lee Marvin was, I believe in the Pacific, was
He
in the
was Lee
Pacific.
Marvin was in the Pacific. He was a Marine. He was terribly wounded during the war, and for all of his action movies, he was a very anti-war guy in real life.
Yeah,
Or kind of opposite of what you see from his tough guy persona. But he was very, as was uh, our main star for Guns of Navarone. One of the
yeah,
reasons he took the
Gregory Peck.
movie is because he was, you know, kind of into its sort of, not anti-war but not pro-war like stance.
Right. Which is just the same as like a lot of the writers from the 60s were vets too. Richard Matheson was a bombardier, which a lot of people don't realize, in World War II, and then Kurt Vonnegut and that kind of thing. So
Well, and including Maclean himself, right? I mean, I believe he was was he a torpedo operator? I remember reading something to that effect. I mean, he was active in the war.
yeah, and so I think that adds an authenticity to his novels and gives them, Dev and I were talking before we started, but it's kind of funny because Alister Maclean novels, you get the sense a lot of times that people forget, or he doesn't care about reminding if people have eaten, or in the timeline it's like the mission kind of takes over. So I know, for example, in Last Night to Kill Nazis, I was looking at the timeline throughout the book and saying, boy, this person really could sit down for a little, right? And trying to come up with reasons to make the timeline work. Because one of the things that's really fun about the Alistair MacLean novels is that he does kind of do the timeline and plan the missions, and you can kind of read along with them. And my memory, I read them all more than a decade ago. So, and I read several of them, and my memory was that Where Eagles Dare was the strongest of the novels. And quite frankly, as an adult, it's like one of the movies that I kind of prefer. But the Navarone books were a huge influence on this one, so I wanted to start with these. But anyways, so Guns of Navarone, one of the interesting things about this production was that they wanted a big movie star, and so Gregory Peck was cast, and that and honestly, like I am a fan of Gregory Peck. He's a fine actor. I mostly remember him for The Omen. and his grandson playing Spock now, which is interesting. But one of my biggest problems that we'll get to with this movie is Gregory Peck, because I really honestly feel they needed a British actor for this. If he wasn't even going to try, then just say he's an American. And like, I kind of have to retcon it in my head and have Mallory be American in my head as I watch this, because he's just not even trying to do the accent. And Robert
I will,
Shaw is not like the best Mallory on the planet, but at least he's British. And
Look, I think it's funny that Gregory Peck does a better German accent in Boys from Brazil than he does even try to do a British accent in this, right? I mean,
right.
he plays a better Nazi in a sense from the accent standpoint than he does a British guy in this.
I will say that Richard Harris is in this movie, and very briefly. He plays the captain of the RAF squadron, the Australian guy who goes on the little tirade about bloody this and bloody that. And I will say that Gregory Peck's attempt at an English accent in this movie is far better than Richard Harris's attempt at an Australian one.
Yeah.
It's really bad.
That's true. So why don't we just go through rewatching this as adults now for this podcast? How did Guns of Navarone age differently for you, starting with Devlin?
I've seen this one so many times. This one didn't really have a lot of difference to me. The only thing that struck me is I did a little bit more reading about the behind the scenes stuff before I watched this time, and kind of wondering where Gregory Peck specifically got his anti-war thing from. And I think it's more the amoral nature of his character in the movie, where he is slowly from the beginning of the movie feeding Franklin this false information because he knows at some point they're going to have to sacrifice him to do their mission, and he wants them to have the false narrative that the British are going to invade the island rather than they're there to blow up the guns.
Right.
And which is something, as a kid, I didn't really pick up on that aspect of it as much.
Yeah, which is interesting because David Niven's character, Miller, he's really bothered by it. And you're right, that is one thing that when I saw it as a kid, I didn't really get the tension of, how much it presents, because we already have Stavros we know wants to kill Mallory at the end of the mission, but now it gives Miller a reason to not like him and really to kind of put him at odds with the rest of the team. So it's a really good dramatic choice, and that does come from the novel. So that's straight from the novel. One of the biggest differences between the novel and the movie is that the two female characters, the two women, are not in it at all. There's and the betrayal comes from within the team, right? And so that's like one of the biggest differences between the novel and in the movie. Mark, how was it different for you seeing it this time?
I think viewing it as an adult, as a 50-year-old guy now, I don't see it. I saw more as almost an epic, right? It does remind me of those sort of epic Technicolor films. It's long, first of all, not that long, but long enough. And it does have several set pieces. I, like Devlin, looked a little bit behind the scenes this time, which I hadn't before. I looked at the director. I found it fascinating, by the way, that
we'll talk about him.
Yeah, because that's an interesting couple interesting things I learned about him and what he had done before, and how his approach to making movies. Which watching this film, you would have never known that he was not a guy who prepared at all. It was like a seat of your pants sort of thing. He would just walk onto a scene and go, "Let's go." No rehearsal, just shoot it. So I viewed it a lot differently. I think I texted you, David, and I said, I totally forgot how much of a badass Anthony Quinn was until I saw this movie, and I forgot how badass Stavros was. I mean, he was a great character. So I viewed it much differently, I think, looking back at having seen other movies, other World War II movies, other Men on a Mission movies, other movies with these tentpole stars. You got David Niven, you got Quinn, you've got Gregory Peck. So I was able to view it a little bit differently, more like a film buff's view of it instead of just someone who's looking to be entertained. And I I was thoroughly entertained, but I was thoroughly impressed by the production of this movie too. I mean, you watch the end of the movie and it still holds up, even though you can clearly tell it's, you know, a model of a mountain.
Right.
It still holds up, right?
Some of the effect shots in this movie are better than the sequel, really.
Oh yeah. Oh, without a doubt, right?
Yeah.
Without a doubt.
Well, and Guns of Navarone was seen as a huge production and a big deal, and the steam and the Alister Maclean um canon had already kind of gone out by the time they made Force 10. So honestly, there was more money and resources to make Guns of Navarone. So even though they had more technology in 1978, they had less, in a lot of regards, they had less resources to make the sequel. And it was a sequel that nobody was really like dying for at that point, right?
Well,
One of the reasons
they were gonna make it earlier, I think, as a matter of fact, with the same director, with Gregory Peck, with
Yep.
Niven. But
Yep,
I honestly, I didn't dig too deep into it, so I don't know why that never came about. But I from what I remember, it was supposed to be a couple years after this came out. They were supposed to
It
be
was
on Navarone.
Was the original plan for the sequel.
Yeah, and that I think it
development
was the
help.
actors themselves who David Niven and Gregory Peck both felt they had aged too much to realistically play the same characters the
And it was
next
only a
day.
couple of years, though. I mean, it wasn't like a vast amount of years. It wasn't the 18 years that it ended up being, right? It was, or 16 years or whatever.
My
So,
thinking is that they probably just didn't want to do it to begin with, and that was their excuse, you know. But you know, and I don't think either. You know, David Niven was on record as saying that he really enjoyed his performance and thought it was one of the better like serious movies that he had been in. But I don't think Gregory Peck put it up high up on the list of his accolades that he really was proud of or happy with. So just didn't seem like he was interested in doing it. Now the sequel novel, the Force 10 novel, came about because of the success of the movie. And Maclean hadn't really done series. And it's funny because some of the divergent plot lines, even though he doesn't get any story credit for it, but some of the differences in the Force 10 screenplay came out of meetings that the screenwriters had with him. And he ended up writing a third book called Partisans that takes place in that region, but it's not technically a third Navarone or Mallory and Miller story. And one of the things I want us to kind of have fun with at the end here is let's spin or pitch what we would do for a third Navarone movie if we could do it. But we'll come back to that. But I want to put that in the back of your brain. Like, what would be a good third Mallory and Miller story? Now, it should be noted at this point that I named the main British character, not the main character, but one of the British agent that's in The Last Night to Kill Nazis is named Mallory as a homage to that. It's not supposed to. I'm not implying that it's the same character. It's just an homage, but that's also because I'm tying it to my novel Boot Boys of the Wolfreich, and the character Mallory from The Last Night to Kill Nazis is in the prologue of Boot Boys of the Wolfreich. And at the time, I made that homage to the Navarone books, not realizing I was going to build the character out into a whole novel. Just thinking it was like one character from one scene and Boot Boys, right? And then that happened, but and yes, so the structure of Guns of Navarone is really fun. You have your whole like this archetype of the mission movie is all here, and we're going to talk a little bit about that because I tried to follow that archetype with the whole thing too, which is that they're given the mission. They have the scene where all the soldiers are sitting around talking about how insane it would be to do it. That's like one of the things. You got that like it would be suicide to do this. And so you have everybody sitting around talking about how crazy it is. Then you have to, get in behind enemy lines and so in this one it's the boat, it's the parachuting in the second one, and so the travel and transport is a huge part of these movies. And but the first act and how it builds, I wonder if anybody else has any feelings about, because I think in retrospect, one of the scenes that I didn't really notice before, but this time seeing it, I like the idea when they're all like throwing out various ideas to blow up the guns that are ridiculous, you know. So anything in the first act you guys really want to comment on as far as otherwise
I feel like in as the format of these mission movies go, I feel like they didn't spend as much time on the setup in this is typical for these sort of movies. Usually like the first whole third of the movie is like them, telling each other how impossible this is going to be.
or training for it.
Yeah,
Or
or putting the team together, right? That was the other thing they kind of moved pretty quick through. I thought.
Yeah. Because, in some of these, you'd have to go to some far out place to find the guy who's like, doesn't want to be bothered by the war and convince him he has to come back.
Yeah, he's got some PTSD. He's like, look, my family, I said I wasn't going to be involved. And then like some sharp thing hits his nerve. And he's like, I'm in.
Yeah.
Bomb goes off near his house, whatever.
That character information throughout the structure of the movie rather than dumping it all at the beginning, which
I
don't necessarily think it's a weakness, but it's just not typical for this particular genre.
Yeah. And
yeah,
for example,
when I rewatched it, for some reason, I thought they explained early on the problem that Stavros has with Mallory. But that actually, as Devlin said, doesn't come until mid-movie, I want to say, in the second act, where you learn that Stavros blames Mallory indirectly for, the death of his family. But I thought that was early on, because I remember the scene with the newspaper from when I was younger, watching that scene, which is just a great, the camera shot of him reading the newspaper with the gun behind it. Fantastic.
Yeah, right. And yeah, so with the structure of the first act, and I should say too, like one of the reasons why, like I, for example, love the fourth Rambo movie is because I felt like it had some of that Men on a Mission kind of set up in the beginning for Rambo, like they had all the different people going on the mission and they had to go and save the missionaries from behind enemy lines. And one of the things I thought was neat about that movie was that, Rambo wasn't even like a thought on the mission, right? And I thought that was kind of neat. And I thought that showed influence from these types of movies as well. But with the structure here, once they get on the mission and like the whole the different action set pieces, kind of build upon each other. You have all the crazy storm they have to go through on the boat, and that actually looked better than I thought it would in retrospect. For 1961, that would be a very hard thing to film. And then of course climbing the rock face, which I definitely homaged the climbing the rock face in Last Night to Kill Nazis. So and the idea that Mallory was this like excellent climber and that's why he was needed, it's interesting because I thought that's so early on in the story for the reason why, but really the reason why Mallory is there is because he's quick on his feet, thinking wise, and he's ruthless. Because you really think in the end, like, okay, the climbing's one thing, but really Mallory's there because he's ruthless, in my opinion. That's why I think he was there. But and then it is kind of hard that watching that scene, imagining like climbing in that kind of rain seems kind of ridiculous, but I don't know. Other than that, if he had to get up there during the rainstorm and they couldn't wait for the morning.
So it's interesting, the climbing the rock face, that scene I think has been used as almost as an homage to that movie in various, like The Princess Bride. They use the same cliffs actually.
Yeah.
In their climbing the rock scene as they do in the Guns of they're in Ireland, the cliffs of, is it Cliffs of Moher, I think. Yeah, they use the exact same cliffs. But this is sort of that the first time I remember ever seeing anything like that, especially with the sliding down. And I thought, I remember seeing it when I was younger, and I was like, that guy's just going to die right here.
I will
At
say
that
that
point, I felt everyone was dispensable.
my memory of that movie, the childhood, the climbing part is way bigger in my memory than any other part of that movie from when I was a child. And I was kind of shocked to watch it now and have it be like,
So
a pretty
early.
brief part of the movie, really.
Yeah.
And you could have built an entire movie around that concept, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's well shot. It's they no point in that movie does it really look like they're just on a sound stage somewhere. It's really well done.
All right. And before maybe let's talk about the director for a little bit. I'm gonna go sideways here a little bit, and we'll get back into the actual story. But is J. Lee Thompson? That's his name, I believe. Yeah. What an interesting filmography this dude has.
Oh yeah.
And the fact that he directed the last two Planet of the Apes movies is one of the things that really made me laugh. And that he did Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, which is, of course, one of the weirdest ones with the ape slave revolt, and has that amazing ending with Caesar like giving the speech. But yeah, his filmography is crazy.
Cape Fear, the original Cape Fear with Gregory Peck, actually.
Which he did right after this. It's the cachet of having all these after having the cachet of a movie that got nominated, because I'm pretty sure Guns of Navarone, it may not have won a bunch of awards, but it had a ton of Academy Award nominations.
Best Picture. I remember that.
Yeah. And so he turned that into Cape Fear, which is really interesting. And so it's funny because he has a great mixture of both like some high class projects and some really pulpy ones. And we can laugh at Conquest and Beneath the Planet of the, or not Battle for the Planet of the Apes, but the Planet of the Apes movies were a big deal in the 70s. So
I personally would never laugh at the Planet of the Apes. Those are some of my favorite movies of all time. All of them.
Yeah,
well,
I would agree.
All the original ones, anyway.
Yeah,
dude, he did Happy Birthday to Me. I was surprised when I saw that, which as a big horror fan, not the best slasher movie, but I'm like, wow, okay, this guy did Happy Birthday to Me. He did. He just did a bunch of random stuff. It seemed like, right? Bunch of Charles Bronson stuff, if I remember.
Well, he became Charles Bronson's go-to director at the end, which is not necessarily at the end like the greatest career move, but if you think about it, he directed Death Wish 3, which is one of the all-time silliest action movies of all. It's on the list of all-timer silly action movies, so of the 80s. So he
for good reason.
Yeah. So
he also did 10 to Midnight, though. 10 to Midnight was a decent film.
It was. And but so if you factor in that Guns of Navarone and Death Wish 3 were directed by the same person, it's really odd, right? It's a really odd like combo of just a career. It's just crazy. And Quentin Tarantino did on his podcast, the Video Archives podcast. I know he talked about J. Lee Thompson in one of the episodes. I think they were talking about, I think it was with Eli Roth, and they were talking about Happy Birthday to Me. And so he went, in his like way that he talks about cinema history, he did a really good job talking about it too. So I recommend that as where you can get more about this director. But yeah, it's a crazy swing to think about Death Wish 3 to Guns of Navarone. It's a very, very different feeling.
And I know we're going to get to talk about, Force 10 and Guy Hamilton, who again has a large and a vast amount of films, although those films I think are much more similar to
each other.
Yeah, to each other than Thompson's films are to each other, right? But still, it's interesting that the two directors they pick weren't ever pigeonholed into just war movies, right? I mean, I guess you could say Hamilton was more of an action guy,
Yeah.
Definitely was an action guy, right? But he wasn't just doing war movies.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So, well, if there's anything else on, I mean, because I think Thompson, his contribution to this in a weird sense is, and you, Mark, you mentioned this because you read up on him, is that he was a very improvisational type of director, and I think some of the things that, yeah, my thing on this movie is that I definitely think you could have lost about 30 minutes of this movie and made it taste better a little bit.
I could have done
But
without actually the storm scene on the boat. I think the boat set piece that you need is that first Nazi encounter when they're fishermen on the boat. I
yes,
think you could have done without the storm scene. But yeah, you could have lost some time on here. It's talking about Thompson. I did want to mention this quote because this is one I had highlighted because I mentioned the improv. This is what Anthony Quinn had said about J. Lee Thompson. Quote, never read a scene until he had to shoot it and approached each shot on a whim. And yet the cumulative effect was astonishing. Lee Thompson made a marvelous picture, but how? Perhaps his inventiveness lay in defying convention, in rejecting the accepted methods of motion picture making and establishing his own. Perhaps it was the very formlessness that he found the one form he could sustain and nurture, the one that he could in turn sustain and nurture him. This is the best line, though. Perhaps he was just a lucky Englishman who pulled a good picture out of his ass. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you could have pulled this picture. He had to have some vision because this picture was too big to just say, yeah, I guess let's shoot this, throw it together.
yeah, I'm sure he.
I feel like in a way, it probably almost complements the movie, that style of filmmaking, because the characters in the movie, as they go, are having to make it up as they go along. So
after the wedding, that whole wedding scene, everything, it feels very loose, right? The characters feel like there's about 5 different things they could do at any time, right? It's not like oftentimes when you read a book, the characters are clearly on a train, right? They're on a path, and things might come in that path, but they're still going, and you know where this is going. In this movie, you get the sense that, yeah, you know what they have to do, but you're still not quite sure how they're going to actually do it, and they're not sure how they're going to actually do it. And up until the very end, even David Niven's like, yeah, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. They kind of do that with the second one a little bit too, although the character that plays Miller is much more smug about it, right? He's like, I kind of knew what we were going to do the whole time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it is very loosey-goosey improv, and I think that plays very well into a Men on a Mission story.
Yeah, because you're gonna have to in these situations, you're gonna have to improv a little bit, and yeah, and it's one thing that, especially in the second one, when the fact that Mallory and I don't know what Harrison Ford's character's name is, like yeah, Han Solo, yeah, when they like they were forced on each other, so a lot of the having to work together is kind of has more of that improvisational feel in the story. But as far as Guns of Navarone goes, is in the final act and everything that happens in it, or where it goes, for me, it's not so much just the boat scene. It's like a lot of the Greek village and like some of the stuff with the betrayal with the 2 women. Like, I just feel like everything could have been a little tighter in Guns of Navarone. So
you mentioned, and I didn't read the
thing.
Go ahead.
Sorry, the most egregious thing I think is probably them finding an excuse for Moondoggy to sing in the village scene.
Yeah,
because James Darren was a pop star before he was a movie guy, so they had to get him in there for a minute to.
You mentioned
James Darren, Vic Fontaine from Deep Space Nine too.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
You mentioned that the women were not in the book. I'm surprised at this point in filmmaking history they included them. They made 2 roles for the women then, because typically wasn't a whole lot of, even in the Dirty Dozen, there just wasn't. Yeah, that you wanted a little bit of romance or whatever, a little sexual tension. I was kind of surprised that they were that involved in this. But
Well, and I think the woman that not the one that didn't speak, but the other one I thought was a pretty well written character, and I liked her motivations for like her like trusting the other woman and then feeling very betrayed by her. Like I'm cool with all that.
I was cool with it. I was just surprised by
Yeah.
they went, hey, I got an idea. Let's write these two roles and put them in there. I was, at that time, I was just like, make a straightforward, go blow up the Nazi installation picture.
Honestly,
so,
since
and one of my hot takes is going to be that I think well, partially, I think Guns of Navarone has more that it could cut and survive than like Force 10. There's very little you could cut. It wouldn't make sense. And
Force 10 could use a little bit more, to be honest with you.
It's what?
Force 10 could use a little bit more.
If anything. Yeah. And so here's the thing, like they're both 2-hour plus movies, and and not my thing about Guns of Navarone is almost 3 hours, right? It like, and it really feels like and yeah, you could do a mini series based on it too, and like really extend the mission and do whole parts of it and you could do like a more extended version where you have the recruiting of the team and do those things, and you could do that, but trying to jam it all into the movie, it does to me suffer a little bit from.
Well, with the narrative though, they give that excuse in the movie as to why they got to go quick, because they got to go rescue these guys. They have like 48 hours, right? I mean, this is it.
Starving. Yeah.
I think it's 7 days.
Starving. Was it 7 days? I don't know why I said 48 hours, but which would have in itself made a pretty interesting. If they only had one night to do something, David, that would be a pretty interesting story. I'd like to read something about that.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? Kill as many as you can.
As many as I've told people about this book, and they're like, "Oh, I like that." I'm like, "Yeah."
Well, yeah. Trying. Well, and here's the thing that when you have the condensed timeline, then you like, it adds to the whole pressure cooker thing, and that's like kind of the idea. And I think the idea of these guys starving on the island, it's interesting that we don't really see them, or like they didn't give any motivation that somebody. I kept expecting watching it this time, like, oh, it's interesting that they didn't give somebody on the team that had a brother there or some other thing like that. And I'm not saying it would have been better. It would have been kind of a stretch, but at the same time, like, I'm surprised they didn't do that. Right.
I actually felt it was a little bit of almost an afterthought watching it this time. I still felt like whether there were people starving on that island or not, you got to get rid of those guns. Those things are massive, right? You got to get rid of them.
You got to get rid of them.
That would help.
So let's talk about Mallory's ethical quandary, because I'm interested to see what you guys think about this. Personally, I think Mallory's thinking on his feet. He's thinking about the mission, and like he knows that guy. I mean, he didn't just go and like end it quick. And I can't remember. I'm sure the guy suggested it. Like, yeah, you got to leave me, or just, and
tries to shoot himself at one point. He crawls off and tries to.
That's right. Yeah. And so
I think Stavros is like, you should just kill him now, right? Because he's just cold blood, and he's like, just save us all time.
Yeah. Yeah. And then and Miller's the one who's like, hey, we gotta try and save him. But I think Mallory's decision is one of the most clever things about the movie is this idea that he's like using him, because I love the tension that it sets up with Miller and like, and in a sense it sets up tension with all of them, because Stavros is just like, just fucking kill the guy.
Yeah.
The way I read it, to be honest with you, was that this was Mallory's plan. Like, this was, as soon as this was an opportunity for him. As soon as Franklin becomes injured, he's like, okay, I can use this. At some point, we're going to have to dump this guy. I'm going to feed him this now, so that when we do have to get rid of him, that will be, he's our ace in the hole almost.
See, I viewed it a little bit differently. I viewed it as, given option A, as they went through it, option A, option B, option C. I thought it was simply just I don't know if it was his plan as much as I know that if I leave them, the conventions require the Germans to take care of him, heal him up. Let's make this an insurance policy. That way we can save him, and at the same time, maybe we throw them off the track, but at the very least, he's not going to give us up. He's not going to blow it for us if I can make him believe this, right?
Yeah.
Which I guess he made him believe, but the logic is flawed there, because the guy's going to tell them the original plan too was to come and blow up the guns, but we've changed plans. We changed plans in the middle of all of this. I mean, the Nazis weren't just going to go, "Why are you here? When are they attacking? What side of are they attacking from?" They're going to ask everything. But I thought it was interesting. I'm not sure much of a moral quandary. At least Gregory Peck didn't play it like he was torn, right? It was like, all right.
Yeah. I think it's cold-blooded, but it's what you got to do. And I don't know, if I was in that situation, I might be more in the Stavros camp, right? Partially because the guy like knows that he's gonna go through a lot of shit, and he doesn't want to go through it either, right? And when you're in that situation, like, and 700 lives are on the line, versus, they all knew what they were signing up for when they left, right?
It was a suicide mission, yeah.
Yeah. And I was
quick
surprised.
Slide here, Dave, if I can interject for a second. Anthony Quayle, he plays Major Franklin, the injured commando. He was in the British SOE in World War II. He was a liaison with Albanian partisans. So this is the sort of mission that he would have been sent on in the war had it been necessary, which I thought was interesting watching this guy. I did not know that on any of my previous viewings of this movie. Like, he was a super secret commando in the war, for real.
Right. And again, with the actors that lived through it, there's that famous story about Christopher Lee on the set of Lord of the Rings, when Peter Jackson was talking about like a character getting stabbed, and they were talking about the sound that it makes, and Christopher Lee said, "No, that's not what it sounds like."
Right. Well, it's kind of, it's the same concept with, going to my horror roots, Tom Savini, who he's like, that is not what blood looks like, right? I was in Vietnam. Yeah, that's not what it looks like. It's sad, but yeah, it's true. You have a technical, by the nature of when this was filmed, you have people who are actual veterans who probably could have gone, that's not how you would have talked to an officer. That's not how you would have talked when you're off duty. That's not,
yeah.
So I'm not as familiar with the accuracy of, the technical aspects of the war movies, but I would assume as they were closer to the war, actors could give input like that, right?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, and that's interesting as far as, but it's funny because when I was younger, the climbing the rock scene and the blowing up of the guns was more like, what I found really interesting. And this time it was Mallory's decision that I was really interested in this time.
I think that the veteran question goes both ways, because yes, a lot of these older World War II movies, the interactions between the people feels more authentic. But in more modern World War II movies, the technical aspects, like the equipment, gear, and everything, is miles ahead of where the movies were in the 60s.
I would agree.
Yeah. Well, and just the technical filming ability, when you can do like single shots like 1917, and make it look as incredible as it does and recreate those things. It's phenomenal what they can do with the technology these days.
But, it's like the old movies. It's like, we'll throw an iron cross on the side of an American tank and call it a day. And now it's like, we're going to build a German tank out of scratch and just throw in this movie.
Right. Right. Absolutely. All right. So we got to get to Force 10 here pretty soon. But as far as my overall thoughts on watching Guns of Navarone this time was, or well, even just the last couple times, is that I just had such a hard time with Gregory Peck not being British. It just really did bug the shit out of me the last couple times. And it would be one thing if you get a really great actor out of it, but I just don't think his performance is so great that we couldn't have gotten a British guy. And to
I
have
would
it,
have liked David Niven would have been good for the Mallory role, right?
yeah, or just rewrite it and say he's the American
American.
operative doing this. And if you're gonna have the guy like not even try, and that's part of my problem with, it's not to, like I can't stand that. Um, well, it bugs me that Florence Pugh can do a Russian accent, but Scarlett Johansson can't in Black Widow. And I actually did like the Black Widow movie, but it just like don't if you're gonna be a Russian character, at least try. And I think they came up with an excuse for why she didn't have an accent, but it's like I know it's a little thing, but for me that bugs me. And I would actually like, and that's one of the reasons why I love Downfall, is because it's actually in German. And if you're gonna do a movie about Hitler's bunker in the last couple of days, it better be in freaking German, right?
Yeah, definitely make it so that the world can meme it to mean other things, whatever they want about anything, and make it
About
hilarious.
anything, which is hilarious. All right. So you guys, last thoughts on overall on Guns of Navarone. My thing is, I would just say my final. I still love Guns of Navarone. I just think it could be like a half an hour shorter and have a British actor. That's the only thing.
For me, I mean, I love I love this movie. I love the way they craft the tension and all the scenes where their plans just go off the rails. My biggest issue with this movie is probably James Darren's character. They don't do anything with him. His death is probably the lamest sequence in this movie. He has like a submachine gun duel with a German officer and like single-handedly mows down like 20 guys. And the more I thought about it, and I'm not going to get into this, but the overall like conceit of this movie, these guns and this pass they have to put these ships through, is ridiculous. But other than that,
in the guns, let's talk about the guns themselves first of all, which was some total sci-fi bullshit. Those things were gigantic, right?
And they were radar controlled,
and
right?
they were, and everyone had to put like their almost like nuclear masks and protection on. And how do you protect yourselves when the guns go off? Just do this.
Okay.
All the Germans had to put their hands on their ears, which is fine, but it was funny watching them all do it at the same time.
Yeah,
guns are probably smaller than some of the ones they actually had during the war. They had a railway gun that would have made that thing look tiny.
Just the way it looked and the way it was set up. Now, I do want to, before we get off of this movie, first of all, I do agree with the submachine gun duel death, which I thought was just very sad. I think the fact that there's not an end to the Stavros is just like, yeah, I'm going to go back to Greece. I'm not going to kill you now. I thought that was a little weird because a little left unresolved. I talked to a friend of mine who's a big World War II buff, a colleague of mine. And David, if you'll let me, can I share my screen? I want to show you something that he has that I looked up and it exists. It says disabled.
All right, go for it.
Let me see if I can do it. I got to get my actual Google Chrome. Here we go. Allow Zoom to share your screen.
Thanks for the commentary.
Yeah, it's not.
Well, you're doing that. I would say that the James Darren thing, yeah, he was a terrible character. He was yeah, definitely not one of the finer moments of Guns of Navarone. So, it is what it is. But and I would say too, it's funny, I guess I'm giving away my hot take is that I actually like Force 10 better. And that might partially be that I watched it more as a kid. Of the two movies, I actually had Force 10 on Betamax when I was a kid, taped off TV. So nice. I watched it multiple times. So I know the movie really, really well. In fact, I had the thought halfway through rewatching it that I did not need to rewatch this.
So evidently I could not share my screen, but that's totally fine. What you need to be aware of is that there is a Navarone playset that you can get. that was made in the early 1970s, including an elevator with the two guns and the mountain. And my friend has this. The ladders and the guns are bright yellow. I don't know. Just Google it. It's fantastic. It's got Jeeps. It's got a big play mat. You know, it was the day of that was the time that every kid had play sets. There's a Navarone play set made by Marx, the Guns of Navarone play set.
Does it look like it's about the size of the Death Star playset?
Yes, with
They
littler,
had the
smaller army
compactor that
men.
you...
Kind of like those
It's
ones they
got-
would have in the back of the comic books, you know, includes 19 riflemen, 4
Yes.
grenadiers, 2 tanks.
There's an elevator. There are like 5 levels to this thing. On the front, it looks like a mountain. On the back, it does kind of look like the Death Star playset, right? It's incredible. I recommend that everyone look up the Guns of Navarone playset. Probably wouldn't have been my first choice as a kid, but there were kids who were at that time still into Army men and stuff like that. Prior to G.I. Joe, it was good. I loved Guns of Navarone. I love the rewatch I did of it. Like I said, the end could have used a little bit more of a wrap up, at least between Anthony Quinn and Mallory. You don't get a sense that there's going to be a sequel, obviously, because the sequel hadn't been written at that point in time. But, you know, you also don't get a sense at the end that these guys were just like, man, we just risked our lives and we did something incredible. You kind of do, but
I mean,
think you get more of that at the end of the Guns of Force 10.
I don't even think they gave us like a wrap up, like, you know, some text on the screen that said the mission to rescue the people from the successful. Thanks.
Yeah, they didn't even do that. It was just like, yeah, I'm gonna go get married to this girl in Greece. See you later. That was Anthony Quinn's the end of that. So
Stavros is in the actual novel of Force 10, by the way. He's on the mission. He's not in the movie, but and I wonder if nobody wanted to step into that role. I don't know.
No, you had to put, and we'll talk about it. You had to put Carl Weathers somewhere.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Which is I actually thought he was good in that movie, but we'll get there. So here's the thing: Stavros was in the novel, and that's one of the bigger differences between the Force 10 novel, and I think Guns of Navarone is a little bit more faithful than the Force 10 movie is to the novel, and a lot more of the politics between the partisans and the Germans and like all the just various factions that are in the Yugoslav area is a bigger deal of the novel, and more kind of like pushes and drives the action forward. Now that being said, I read it 10 plus years ago, so my memory of it is so. Another, not to just turn this into David's World War II mission novels, but my novel, The Goddamn Killing Machines, also from Clash Books, which is already out and you can get, is my 24th century version of this kind of men on a mission thing. And I read Force 10 from Navarone right before I wrote the original version of Killing Machines in like 2010. So it would have been 13 years ago. It would have been 13 years ago that I read it. So my memory is here or there. Okay, so now Force 10 from Navarone was also an ABC TV movie, and that's how I taped it. And I sat and paused out all the commercials. So with my remote on a cord to my Betamax, tell you how far back that goes. So I had it on video and I watched it many times as a kid, because partially the Harrison Ford of it all, and that I just love these types of movies. And so some of the beats and the things that are going on in Force 10, I know a little bit more. And I will say my hot take is that Guns of Navarone is considered the better movie, like objectively, because it was nominated for all these awards and everything. But my heart of hearts, I like Force 10 from Navarone slightly better. And when Mark and I were sending texts back and forth with each other about this, he said that it had a James Bond pacing.
It does. Well, and there's a reason, right?
Very good.
And I said the problem detected where, because and this was directed by not the director of a bunch of Planet of the Apes movies, but a director of a bunch of James Bond movies, Guy Hamilton, and who was just coming off of The Spy Who Loved Me. And we have two actors straight from The Spy Who Loved Me, and Barbara Bach and Richard Kiel, Jaws. And so it has like James Bond DNA all over it. But
Dude, the Guy Hamilton started with Goldfinger. He did like 6 James Bond movies. And when I was a kid, that's why I think I loved it so much, because it really was a war James Bond movie. Even like the little the little twists that were in it, right? Were so James Bond-esque. Richard Kiel.
Yeah.
I mean, he's not.
That's really the difference. Because one, Guns is it's a drama movie. It is, and this is a straightforward action movie. It's not got the depth of it that Guns was supposed to have. But that's not necessarily, that's not a knock on it. It's just they're in two different genres.
Movie.
Really.
Yeah.
I mean, this has the humor that you would find in any of those James Bond-esque movies, right? Shaw plays it a lot more tongue-in-cheek. So does the guy who plays Miller in this plays it very tongue-in-cheek. The reason I wanted to see it was, again, Han Solo was in it. I was like, hey, there's a movie with Han Solo. Let's go watch it. And I thoroughly enjoyed it as a kid. It was boom, 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 boom. Watching it now, I don't know.
Well, look,
I don't dislike it. But I like it as much as I would say I like most of those mid James Bond movies. I mean, Goldfinger, I think, was a high point for James Bond. When you're getting to like, even The Spy Who Loved Me is still pretty good. Diamonds Are Forever. I mean, that I approached it as much as I like some of those mid James Bond movies.
Well, and I will say this: they were gambling with this one. They had 3 actors coming off blockbusters. They had Carl Weathers coming off Rocky. They had Robert Shaw coming off of Jaws, and you had Harrison Ford just being in Star Wars. And let's not forget American Graffiti too. He was in that, which was a big deal in the 70s. So lost the time a little bit, but these 3 actors, weren't without cachet at that time because of the movies that they had been in, even though they were all young at the time. And this was pre-Predator, Carl Weathers, because let's face it, to me, the most important role he ever played was not Apollo Creed, but in Predator. And which, by the way, Predator could be a World War II meta-mission movie in many ways too.
Carl Weathers, I think, is probably my biggest complaint about this, and it's not because I don't like Carl Weathers, just because they don't do anything with him. You've got Carl Weathers, and he's barely in it.
That's part of it. What I really don't like about the Carl Weathers role in this movie, you're right, had they done something with him, even if he had died and it had been a sacrificed character, would have been great. I feel like from the moment he arrives on screen, and it's so contrived. That was the problem I had, right? He's so contrived. He's held prisoner by some MPs who just happen upon this plane. Those guys go crazy. He hops on he forces himself on the plane. He forces himself into this mission. And then he doesn't really do much. I mean, that's...
I think the Navarone cast would have pushed him out of the plane.
Probably. Oh, Stavros would have just shot him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting too, because I do kind of like the idea that he's just there. And then but at the same time, if Mallory's scene hit that he helped them and they got on the plane because he helped beat up the MPs, maybe if they had played it as Mallory's scene that they have something in this guy, maybe he saw how he used his knife or whatever, it would have worked a little better. Obviously that character's not in the book. And he does a lot of the things that Stavros physically did in the book. But I do like the scene when he's like refusing to drive the truck and the partisans are coming and they had that kind of showdown. They were a little timid to do like full on talking about racism in that moment, which if you had gone there with it, it would have been more interesting, and it would have made the movie better. Like, it wouldn't have made it
Sure.
as commercial.
The subtext was there, but they tiptoed around it, like, noticeably.
Exactly. If they didn't tiptoe around it, right? Like, let's say Quentin Tarantino is directing it, right? He wouldn't have tiptoed around it. He would have done it. And like, in that sense, I understand why a mainstream movie at that time tiptoed around it. But
Well, and that wasn't the purpose Carl Weathers was there, right? Again, he was there because he was a box office draw. I will say that what I also didn't like about that character is at the end, he's celebrating like he himself blew it all up. He's like, you did it, you did it. I'm like, you literally less than a week ago were under arrest for something that we don't even know which. I don't even recall they said what he did to get under arrest.
No, they didn't. And
well, we know he murdered someone. I don't know.
Yeah, in the postscript of this movie, they sent him back to a military, court martial when he was hung. Well, I don't know,
Well, wouldn't that be interesting too if he was like a murderer and Mallory makes the decision like, hey, we can use him,
I mean, at the very least is technically a deserter at this point, which they
Correct.
would have hung him for in World War II.
Right. So, yeah. So he could have done interesting things with the character and they didn't quite do it. But I like the idea that they had to steal the plane to make it look like, and which, Mallory uses. I like the idea that Mallory's kind of forced on them and they all think he's like this old coot, like, who is he? And then Mallory has to prove himself to Ford. That's all stuff I think personally for me works as far as like interesting drama. The one of the and lest we forget, the star of Enter the Ninja, a year or two before that with Franco Nero.
Yeah, let's talk about Franco Nero. All right, I love Franco Nero. I am a huge Franco Nero fan, right? But to shoehorn him, that's another thing. You could have come up with a better. You have to go kill a guy who betrayed you in the first movie, right? But by the way, he doesn't look like you remember he looked because he had plastic surgery. Just make it another guy that wasn't so. It didn't have to be that whole personal connection to the first movie, And then at the end he goes, "I always knew it was you." Well, yeah, duh. You should have just shot him. It would have saved everyone a whole lot of time, right? I understand why you didn't, but
I will admit that is a convoluted part of the story and didn't work quite as well. But Franco Nero was great.
Oh yeah,
Franco Nero is always great. My problem with his character is there's like about 7 opportunities for him to, derail this mission that he does not take.
And the way he tries to do it at the end is the best, right? Where he's just waiting for them all to be locked inside of a boxcar, and that's when he decides, "Hey, I'm gonna put them all in one place. I'm gonna go get all the German troops and bring them back." And they're watching him through there, going, "Oh, he's talking to the guy. What's he?" They keep looking over here. What's he telling them? Oh, he's probably telling them blah 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 blah. The guy walks away. Franco Nero doesn't come back to the boxcar at first. It was convoluted, and I was like, man, at some point you have to be. This is the guy that you were sent to kill and you thought was your guy, and he's acting kind of suspicious. No second guesses here,
right? Yeah. Okay, so you're showing me some of the holes. I admit that
it was still a fun movie, but compared to the first one,
it is what, Devlin?
It's an enjoyable film for sure. There are just some more glaring, issues with this one, I think.
Right. And you had more hands trying to rewrite it, and they had so I do think that it's probably some of those issues, and they were probably trying to keep all the different actors happy. I appreciate the fact that Mallory is British. Even Robert Shaw isn't the youngest, brightest action star.
Is there a story as why they picked Robert Shaw, by the way? I didn't.
Jaws.
Was it just Jaws? Was it strictly just box office?
I'm sure it was Jaws. Yeah, I'm sure it was that he was in Jaws, and but as far as specifically why, no, I don't know on that. But it's funny because Mallory in my head is Robert Shaw. I like, admittedly, just because I watched this movie more as a kid. And I don't really see Gregory Peck in my head, partially because he just didn't even try to do the British accent. But well, so because when I read the books, it's funny because if you've seen the movies, you sometimes picture the actors in your head, and I definitely was picturing Robert Shaw when I was reading the books and not Gregory Peck. So that might be an interesting thing about my read on all this. But yeah. And then Force 10, I think, one of the things that's kind of interesting about it too is that you have the whole thing of where they had to blow something up at the end. So, and that was a real bridge and a real part of the war. I read about it a little bit, and there's a Yugoslavian movie about the battle and the destruction of that bridge.
Starring Franco Nero.
Yeah. And so eventually got to see that one now, if I can. And but it's interesting too because I didn't know that was a real bridge that had a real history and all that. The
That's
timing
one
of
the strengths of this production, I think, is that it's filmed on location in Yugoslavia, and that it shows in a lot of the this is the technical stuff that I noticed, but a lot of the equipment and weaponry and stuff like that is a little more authentic than an American production at that time would have been because it was shot in Yugoslavia where they still had a lot of this stuff on hand.
Yeah. Right. And yeah, the filming, I think a lot of like the stuff like the exteriors with the actors and things like that, I think are all pretty good. I like Harrison Ford and Mallory. Like I like those two characters kind of working together and learning to work together. And I like that they killed two of the people on their side and just didn't even like, oh well, sorry, they were following us. And the British what was it, colonel that was like behind enemy lines with the partisans, he was an interesting character. He reminded me of the bad admirals from Star Trek a little bit because like he wasn't very supportive of their mission as they were kind of going through and doing this. But
I will say this. One thing that is a glaring difference, and I think this is what makes the movies different. They're both action movies. I think Force 10 is a straight action movie more than a war movie, where I think Guns is more of a war movie than a straight action movie. But the climax is when you compare them to each other, the tension is so there with Guns, right? The elevator goes down, 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 and then it stops right before it hits the explosive. And then it goes back up. And it does this 2 times right before it hits. Whereas the end of Guns, it goes off and nothing happens. And everyone's like, what happened?
Oh, you mean
Force
10?
I'm sorry, Force 10. Yeah. And then you got Miller, who's like, just got to wait a little bit. And then all the Germans are kind of looking around, and it builds, but there's the tension doesn't seem to be there, right? I think that's part of the problem I have, where I don't think is as good of a film.
I think it's because Miller sort of spills the beans. You know what I mean? If they'd waited and give his explanation till afterwards, I think it would have kept the tension a little bit more.
Well, and I do like I like the scene when they're inside the dam and they're like, that son of a bitch, it didn't work. Like I actually love that scene. I think and then when they have to like start running, and maybe it's because I don't know, Harrison Ford I think plays that really well because it kind of fits with a lot of the characters he plays where it just reminds me of Indy running, like when he's so tired and like
just throws his hands up and he goes, yeah,
what the hell? Yeah.
What the hell? Exactly.
Kind of fits his personality, I guess. But yeah, and so I admit it works for me in a regard. Probably works for me better than it should.
I will say this is the part that I had the technical issues with. The dam exploding, not a problem. It looks fine. But it's when they're showing the water rushing, which is clearly forced perspective. It really reminds me of when you see the water in Clash of the Titans going through the Greek city, right? Where it's flooding, and it's clearly just kind of like, hey, let's pump some water through this model. Or let's pump some water through this brook.
Now, Mark, I've been holding on to this fact since Now you might remember that I said this in episode 100. This is episode 107, and you were on episode 100 when we talked about V and V the Final Battle. There's the scene in V the Final Battle where they unleash all the water that the visitors have stolen. Stock footage, same stock footage as this movie. And I mentioned it in the V episode that was in Force 10. Yes, it is that scene of the river is used in both V the Final Battle and Force 10. I think it was created for this movie, but it was used again.
It's definitely a Toho school effect.
Yes, it is. I would agree. Let's get as close as we can to a very narrow area where we're going to push some water through. And then, of course, you do get sort of a wrap up there where it's like, which I kind of enjoy the end of Force 10 more so than I enjoyed the end of Guns, because Guns just kind of abruptly ends, right? You don't go into why everyone's doing what they're doing. But Force 10, it pans out, and he's like, well, we're on the wrong side of the river. Now what are we going to do? Well, we could go do this, and it just sort of zooms out, and the sound trails off, and it's more of a James Bond pan out that you would have seen in James Bond movies, where he's on a raft with a woman, and they were just panning out. But I enjoyed that ending more to this than I did the finality of Guns.
It's a more satisfying conclusion for sure.
Yeah, and it kind of promises more adventures, that they're going to have an adventure to get onto the right side of the river, right? And okay, so any overall last thoughts on Force 10, and then we'll talk about a third Navarone. Starting with Mark.
No, I think Force 10 again. The issues I have with it are some of the issues that I have with a lot of movies. As a kid, I was really into that kind of thing, and I can appreciate it for what it is. Looking at it with more of a critical eye, having seen other war movies, having seen other things, it's Guns is. I feel like I'm getting a good meal. Force 10, I feel like I'm getting pizza. It's just a fun time, and I enjoyed it. And pizza's good. There's some great pizza, but pizza's good. I felt Force 10 gave me some steak. I do appreciate, even though he wasn't British, Gregory Peck in there. Quinn was awesome. Niven is awesome. I love the fact that Franco Nero is in Force 10. I really love the fact that Franco Nero, and he plays such a clean-looking guy too. That's the best part.
Only 2 years before Enter the Ninja, too.
Yeah, because often when you see Franco Nero, he's usually covered in dust or something, and but yeah,
on Django mode.
Yeah, Django, in full Django mode, exactly.
Yeah, and certainly when I saw this as a kid, I had no idea who Franco Nero was at first, but then I was a huge, like everybody our age, I love ninja movies. So eventually, like, it's the Enter the Ninja guy, was definitely like a big thing. Dev, your overall thoughts on these two movies?
It's a decent action movie. It's not my favorite. There are a few things where, it's definitely of a James Bond mold, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think if they could have done anything better, I would have given a little more attention to the sort of dynamics there between the partisans and the Chetniks and everything that's going on. Yugoslav theater is not something that you ever see in American, war movies or anything really. And it's pretty fascinating. So maybe they could have dove a little deeper in there. I think the sole contribution they have to that is Jaws has one line who's like, "We are Chetniks, we fight for Germans," and that's about it. But it's good. It's a solid action movie. It doesn't hit the same way Guns does.
No, on that, because the Yugoslav theater and like Eastern Europe, like we didn't see a lot of that. It's right that there's a lot of stories left out there, like from that region of the war, probably to be mined for stories to get. Just the politics of like the partisans and like how the Nazis kind of forced their way into that area and had to kind of deal with an asymmetrical thing throughout the whole part of the war. At least it seems to me that there would be more interesting stories.
It went over $10 million on its budget. I think I mean, it was regarded. It was they knew what they were making. They were making a movie to capitalize both on. I don't think you could have made Guns of Navarone at the time you made Force 10 and it been as successful. People were in that action mode. People were in that James Bond mode. People wanted to see action, 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 big set pieces. Even though Guns has that, it does feel more epic, more classic, I guess. And I'm not sure it would have been as successful in 1978 as it was in the 60s.
I'm gonna go out here. This is probably a minority opinion, but I actually like Edward Fox as Miller better than David Niven. I just like Edward
I
Fox.
agree.
Like,
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I think his smugness is better. Niven at times comes off being very aggressive towards Mallory, where Fox, now granted, these characters supposedly had been together and gone through a lot by the time they got to Force 10, but they do seem there's a little bit more cohesion with the two characters in this. Because in Guns, there is that scene where they totally disagree, right? And Niven's Miller is like, I can't believe you did this. Why would you do this? You know, and he was ready to quit.
Well, and I think Miller in Force 10 has a certain cool about him, like when he's like sitting there smoking the pipe and everybody else is like,
he's just so British.
yeah,
I don't know how else to describe it.
exactly. Yeah, and his like when Carl Weathers is like, what the hell, man? It didn't do anything, and he's just sitting there like, calmly waiting. It works really, really well. So yeah, no, I think that those hot takes are valid, because I think, people are gonna, obviously David Niven was a big star and uh, famous in that regard, so people are just gonna automatically assume he was better, and that's no.
If you want to see, David, ever a movie that's a real stinker, it's a movie called Seawolves. It's a World War II mission movie from 1980, starring Gregory Peck and David Niven. And
I have heard about that, and I do need to see it. Yeah,
it's really bad. It's one of these movies where they made no attention to like the setting at all. Like everyone's kind of dressed like the 70s. Like Roger Moore's in. He's got like sideburns and like kind of a almost like a leisure suit on. It's a stinker, but it's worth one watch for sure.
Yeah, Roger Moore was in another. It wasn't World War II, but he was in a mission movie around that time that had been on my list.
Wild Geese, probably.
Wild Geese. No,
yeah,
wait, I did watch.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I did watch that. That was good. I mean, not like good, but fun, good,
entertaining. Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
The alcohol budget on that movie must have been about $1 million.
I do remember when Force 10 came out on video too. It was the green box with a small photo in the middle of the green box, no artwork, and it was just Harrison Ford's face and Robert Shaw's sort of off to the side, but it was mostly Harrison Ford in this small picture. I don't know if you remember what this video box looked like, but yeah.
Well, and it's funny because we studied a lot of Alister Maclean covers when we were putting together the cover for Last Night to Kill Nazis, and we looked at a lot of these old 70s ones and with like attention to detail. And there was one version of the paperback that came out like as a mission attaché case. Looked like, you were opening up the classified folder, and I thought that was really, really cool. And I don't think that, the video companies ever did anything that interesting, but if you get a chance to look at some of the covers for the Alister Maclean novels, they are pretty cool. And not to toot our own horns too much, but with Last Night to Kill Nazis, we were definitely trying to kind of go for that vibe. And if you notice, the vampire is definitely got a partisan look, and not for no reason. Yeah. But yeah, so on that note, the last thing I want to think about before we go is just kind of play around with the idea of what do you guys think would be a cool third Navarone story, like a Mallory Miller Stavros adventure, because the thing is this part of the war was 1943, so we have 2 more years of potential missions for Mallory and Miller and Stavros to get involved in. And the first one was in Greece, the second one was in Yugoslavia. And so, of course, because I think about like the last days of the war, because that's what I researched a lot, one of the ideas I had was about that. But I also thought it would be interesting to put those guys for some reason behind the Russian front. For some reason, maybe they had a mission there. But another thing that they could do is Rommel and North Africa and sabotaging some kind of tank depot or something is what I thought. You guys have any thoughts on what they could be doing?
I think your initial idea there is what I would go with. In fact, I would kind of go the Alister Maclean route and not give these guys any rest. I'd pick up right where Force 10 has left off. They can't go west. They got to go east. Send them over to the Russians and find something interesting for them to do over there. I think that would be the way to go.
See, I have two different ideas here. And part of it, my idea for following straight out of Force 10 is you go the escape route. Either these guys are there and they get captured. And if you're putting Stavros back in it, maybe Stavros is sent on his own mission, men on a mission with his group to go rescue these guys and fight their way out. Or these guys aren't captured and they just have to fight their way out and just cause as much destruction as possible. Or as they're leaving Yugoslavia, as they're fighting their way out, they come upon they learn about a plan, right? A German plan that no one knows about yet. And they're like, we could escape or we could go do this.
Right.
And foil this big plan. They're building like, a death ray or something. Let's go. Maybe not a death ray, but you know what I'm saying. They're building the second Navarone gun tower, and it's getting ready to blow up something.
It can hit Star.
Yes, exactly. In a way, yes, but they could have done that. I also like the idea if you're going to move it to a different setting. It's funny because I just came back from a trip to Norway, and it was an incredible place to be. But I learned a lot about their World War II history, and they were just decimated. And no one talks about how when the Nazis were driven out of Norway, they just destroyed everything. It would be interesting to see because he did Ice Station Zebra, Maclean did. And I think it would be, you don't see a lot of those World War II Arctic sort of things that happened in again, going to Russia and going to the Eastern Front. So I think, yeah, you could have easily done something there, but I would have liked to have seen.
Norway is interesting because you could have them have to get like some kind of plans or something out of an Arctic.
Norway was totally taken over by the Germans, right?
Norway is where the Nazis' nuclear program was based out of.
Yeah, you could have done a lot. You could have done a lot there, but I do like from an action film goer, I like the idea of them having to escape and then just going, wait a minute.
I think
there is the way out. It's right there. The door is right there. We can all get out and be free. But the Nazis are working on something. We're not 100% sure what it is, and we're not even sure it's going to be successful. But we can stop whatever it is.
So here's what I would do if it was Norway. If it was Norway, I think Dev is on to the right thing with the nuclear program.
Let's write it.
So. When the Germans are pulling out and like doing their like scorched earth in Norway, in the midst of this, intelligence reports come in that there's an American scientist has been captured and has been taken to this place up there, and your mission is to go assassinate this American guy so he can't give up any secrets. Maybe somebody who was taken from, and then because then it comes up with the quandary of like, well, you could rescue him, but Mallory's given the orders to kill him. Like, don't even bother.
You could go the other way. They've captured a Russian who knows about the nuclear program. You have to go get him before they kill him, so he can become an American or a British asset, right?
My sort of idea. I think you need to up the stakes on this to a point. I think sending them sort of into the the Eastern Front, the Russian theater, would be good if you could make it so that they don't have any allies this time. They need to get back or get somewhere, but the Germans are after them, and they have something. Give them something the Russians want too. So they've got the the NKVD after them just as much as they do the Germans. Just
There
put
you
them
go.
completely on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I like that. And then, well, and I don't know I don't know a lot about the North Africa Rommel thing to
That had mostly wound down by the time period we're talking about here.
okay.
But there could be again a lost asset that was there, right?
Yeah.
That hey, now the Russians. It could even be, hey, the Russians have discovered this. You're not even necessarily fighting against the Germans or the Russians. You're fighting against the clock because both sides remember this asset is there, or they've all discovered it at the same time. Let's go get it before
Right.
everyone else does, right?
Well, and if you go to North Africa, then you can do kind of like a Mallory Lawrence of Arabia type story, which I know is a fraught thing to try and do, which because that's what they wanted to do with Rainbow 3. Right?
I would still
was interesting on this watch through of Force 10 is I never really noticed that the head Nazi guy when they're captured at the beginning at the partisan village is the same Nazi guy from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
Yeah, on the tickets please guy. Yeah. Yeah. That was crazy. Yeah, and it's funny because he looks the same because it's not that it's like 10 years apart. So
I'll take it in a different direction, David. What if we were making this movie today? And you could make a viable movie of this today, right? An action movie. Who are you casting it? How are you casting this movie? Who's a modern Mallory? Who's a modern Miller?
That's a tough one.
yeah, I got to think of my British actors.
Fassbender? I mean,
Fassbender would be great. Yeah, he would be great.
Fassbender would make a good, absolutely.
Yeah, he would make a great Mallory, and then geez, I don't know who I'd have as Miller, but you'd have to have a cool cat. Yeah, I don't know a lot of the younger British actors.
Miller, you could probably cast in sort of a more nerdy direction. Maybe get like Matt Smith or something as Miller.
Oh yeah,
you could. But you could even go if you wanted to go with and I know older is not necessarily better, but you could even go like if you were to do it later on in the campaign, you could do and not go for the continuation, do with like a Gary Oldman, right? Who's been like now he's grizzled, right? Now he's like because you've seen Robert Shaw. I mean, he's too old. But look what they did with Robert Shaw, right? I mean,
right. Well, look here's the thing:
here's the thing.
If you make it now, you're suspending a bit of disbelief by putting a new actor in it, anyways. So,
right. Well, in real life, a lot of those British special ops guys were like a lot of that stuff wasn't, it didn't come down from the government. It was like some British guy had an idea, and he's like, "We could do this. I'm gonna go get some of my polo buddies and put together a little team and do that." Like that's sort of how the SAS started. It was a bunch of guys got together and decided to do it. It wasn't like a top-down decision.
So I think you get that feeling in this movie too, right? You get that feeling when they're called in for Force 10 that it was just like three guys. You get that feeling in Inglourious Bastards where they're called in that it's just like two or three guys who are like, "Hey, I've got an idea. Let's just send these guys to go do this."
Well, and a lot of the OSS operations came out of Turkey, which is weird. Is Istanbul? So you could also do a story that is set in because the reason why Istanbul was an interesting place to do that is because both all the governments had embassies in Istanbul, and so a lot of intrigue happened there. So you could do a story there too.
It's like a more straight type thing, yeah.
Yeah, and then I know my Mallory and last night I built up his backstory, and the way I did it is I saw him as being an older guy who was a vet of World War I, who basically got into it because his boys were becoming war age soon, and he basically made a promise to his wife that he would try to end the war before they had to fight, and that they survived the Blitz. And so that was kind of my excuse to make Mallory a little bit older, as to have him be a vet. And so I mean you could do that with the casting of the actor, but I think Fassbender would be great if you could get Fassbender. He would be.
You want to feel old for a second, Dave? It's like we are old enough right now that we could have been in both of those wars easily.
Oh yeah,
yeah. exactly.
And
Well,
and who do you get? Who's the guy who's sending him out on the mission? I mean that because you got to have a notable. Even in Inglourious Bastards, don't they? It's not Mike Myers. Who's Mike
It is
Myers? Is
it
it
is
Mike
Mike
Myers? Yeah,
Myers.
it's Mike Myers. Is it Colin Firth? It's got to be some notable actor who's just getting a cameo just to send them out on the.
Yeah,
Or
in my book, the character was
Michael
filled
Caine's too old, unfortunately.
yeah,
well,
in
but he
my
could
book
send
it
them
was
out, right? I
the
mean, he's just
character
sending them out.
yeah. The character in my book was Field Marshal Bruner, which was an homage to science fiction writer John Brunner, of course, British, my favorite British science fiction writer. And yeah, I think you would want to have, yeah, Colin Firth would be a good one. It's
Got to
like,
be a
or
good
Hugh
cameo.
Grant, somebody who looks like older and, like sends them on the mission. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, a story set in Istanbul with like the various spies could be really, really interesting.
more of an
Especially
espionage, instead of an action.
Yeah, so if the Alister Maclean estate wants to hire us to write new Mallory movies, we're available. We could do a whole series of them. Yeah, that would be fun. All right, on that note, I don't know which this is episode 107 of the podcast, and we're between now and August, September, as the book is in pre-order and is going to come out. By the book, I mean, of course, The Last Night to Kill Nazis. We're going to talk about other World War II. I'm sure Mark and Devlin will be back, but I also have my buddies Ivan and Dino who are going to step in and do some. Ivan is Serbian, so he definitely, and he has wanted me to do movies that are made in that region for World War II. So those should be really, I think we're going to have some really interesting ones. I know ones we're for sure going to cover. I think next time we're doing Clint Eastwood. We're doing Where Eagles Dare and Kelly's Heroes for the next one.
Again, a Maclean, probably the best of those his adapt. I never really read a lot of those books. I do remember reading Where Eagles Dare.
Where
Great
Eagles
movie.
Dare, yeah,
My favorite of those types of movies.
Yeah, and so I think we'll be doing those next. So if people want to watch along and watch these movies with us, that's going to be that. And then after that, I think I'm going to try to choose two that I hadn't seen before. So and I'm leaning towards Five Graves to Cairo and Attack. But it's been a long time since I saw Bridge Too Far, and definitely, Dev, we will do Bridge Too Far for sure.
Dave, have you seen The Eagle Has Landed?
I don't think so.
It's Michael Caine, and he's part of a German team that's sent to England to assassinate Winston Churchill.
Oh yeah, I did read about that because I think it's in Gov Rosenfeld, who shout out to Hoosier Gov Rosenfeld, who's a historian that grew up in Bloomington, who did the book the World Hitler Never Made, of the alternate histories of World War II, which is an incredible book, by the way. If anyone hasn't read it, it's an entire academic tome on alternate Nazism, and I think he talked about that movie quite a bit in that book. But yeah, I need to see that. No, I haven't seen it. So definitely on my list. So, but if anybody else has suggestions for things that they want us to cover on here, you can make comments, especially on YouTube. It's easy for me to find, and or at me at Twitter. And we'll, see what we can do. We have a list of ones that we probably won't get to all of them between now and the next couple months, but this is going to be one of the main things I'm going to be doing on the podcast in the near future because it's going to be fun.
David,
So
I'm very upset right now. Why am I upset? Because I just looked up something, and evidently the movie we wanted to make about Norway has been made. I've never seen this movie, The Heroes of Telemark, with Kirk Douglas and Richard Harris.
I saw it a long time ago. But
Norwegian resistance tries to stop German efforts to produce an atomic bomb component in World War II.
That's
hey,
it's based on a true story.
Yeah, it is. But hey.
Another movie to cover, but Well, I guess
I'll sign up for that one. Yeah.
We still got our Russian front and our Istanbul Mallory novel. So right.
And don't forget about the time they were sent to the Pacific Theater, because
Well, it's interesting enough. I'm not going to say too much, but I have an outline novel for a World War II Pacific men on a mission novel. The only thing is there's no supernatural angle to it or no horror sci-fi angle to it for me, which is fine, but I just don't know that anyone would publish my
you could put one in. It's
straight
not
World
that
War II
hard.
novel yet.
There's a lot of Asian Pacific stuff out there.
It's some of those jumping Chinese vampires. There you go.
Well, that's true. Well, I have honestly, I have thought about how to add something to this story, and then I thought, nah, I'll just save it. Maybe someday I'll write it. But hopefully the idea is this book sells enough. Somebody will be like, yeah, we want your straight World War II novel. All right. On that note, guys, I don't know if you want anyone to find you to talk to you about this stuff, or but we will do this again at some point. And anything else you want to say before we go about the Guns of Navarone, Force 10 from Navarone?
No, thanks just for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed this.
You know me, I always like to talk about movies.
Right. And for the folks who don't know, Mark is my longest running horror nerd friend. So he is an extremely well-read horror nerd, and we do the best reads of the year every year together. So
and I think I might have already read my best read of this year, David. I'm not sure. It'd be hard to top one of the books I already read this year. So we'll see.
So far, the best thing I've read all year is S.B. Divya's Maru, which was the last interview I did on this podcast. So, which is a woman falling in love with her starship, living starship book. Which
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. And Dev, like I said, Devlin, you know World War II better than most people I know. So I thank you for your expertise in this arena, and you will definitely be back. And thank you for all your insight. On that note, everybody, if you need to find these folks to talk to them, all the threads that are going about this podcast with me, I'll make sure that they know if you have any comments for them, and continue to and anybody who wants to help us promote The Last Night to Kill Nazis. I'm going to have postcards soon that I'm going to be sending out to bookstores and libraries, but it always helps if you can request it at your local library and let them know. This book is distributed by a consortium, so it's a nationally distributed book, and it should be any bookstore should be able to carry it when the time comes. So please make requests out there. And if you're new to us and you just found us because of World War II movie interest, this podcast covers mostly horror and science fiction. And I highly recommend. I did a series on 1930s science fiction last year, and I highly recommend that series. Find more stuff out there, and thank you for joining us tonight. And continue to, and let us know, like I said, let us know in the comments if you have anything you want us to cover. So thanks a lot, folks, and we'll talk next time.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.